So let's dive into histidine. Histidine is an essential amino acid, first isolated in 1896 by a Nobel Prize-winning German physician by the name of Albrecht Kossel. It's one of the 20 standard amino acids used in protein production in the body, and it's categorized as essential. Now, keep in mind, remember that essential means that your body cannot produce it. You have to eat it. And so if you don't eat enough, you suffer the consequences, so to speak. And so keeping in mind, when we talk about amino acids are derived from protein. And anytime we engage in this conversation, especially in today's age, there's a concentrated, concerted effort, especially in today's kind of nutritional dogma, about demonizing protein from animals. And so there's this big trend, and people are pushing toward plant-based proteins and cricket-based proteins and processed proteins that come from things like soy, etc. But we really want to make sure we're getting adequate histidine through real food. And so you can't leave protein out of the equation. Too many doctors have demonized it, so don't fall prey to that. And if you haven't already, check out my crash course on protein, and it'll give you a general overview of that topic so that you don't fall into a trap. Now, let's talk about histidine's functions. There's several of them. We'll do a deeper dive on it, but kind of in synopsis here, one of the core functions of histidine is the production of histamine. Now, this may be sounding familiar to many of you because histamine, commonly doctors prescribe antihistamine drugs or antihistamines, and that's to combat things like allergies, the symptoms of allergies, the watery, teary, itchy eyes, the sneezing, the coughing, the itchiness, etc. So, and we are in springtime, but you can't make histamine without histidine. And so some of you may be thinking, well, man, I'm going to take the histidine out of my diet so that I'm not as allergic. It doesn't work quite that way, and we'll get into it in a minute. Histamine is not just, though, for allergies. Histamine is a precursor to making stomach acid. It's a precursor amino neurotransmitter in your brain, so it helps your brain function. That's why when you take an antihistamine, you get sleepy and groggy. So histamine production, very key. Number two, nervous system and myelin support production. So histidine contributes to the production of the myelin sheath, which is essential for nerve protection and cognitive health. Remember, the sheath around your nerves, the insulator around your nerves, so that the electrical system of your body works properly. We know that histidine is critical for the transport of oxygen. It helps in the production of that protein called hemoglobin. You know, if you've ever gone to your doctor and done a general chemistry test, where they measured a CBC, a complete blood count. Usually hemoglobin is part of that test, and it's an indicator, sometimes if it's low, of anemia. Well, you can't make hemoglobin without histidine, very important, and so that hemoglobin carries the oxygen to all of your cells in your body, making sure you have enough of it to generate and drive energy, but it also is very important for stabilization of blood pH. The blood pH should be relatively alkaline, and so again, if you don't have adequate histidine, you can affect that tremendously. Enzyme and metal ion binding. Histidine binds certain metals. It can bind with zinc and copper. It can bind with iron, and you know it's important that it makes those binds because, like in the case of hemoglobin, it's binding with iron. But there are several proteins where histidine will bind with zinc and copper to provide certain types of antioxidant functions. As you can see here, anabolic or antioxidant rather, and metabolic enzyme functions. So we need histidine for those things. We also have pH buffering. As we mentioned over here, it plays a role in pH, but its unique structure allows histidine to act as a natural acid-base buffer, especially with red blood cells, but it does this as well in muscle cells very well. One of the things that histidine helps to produce is a compound called carnosine, which is a dipeptide, and it serves as tremendous support for the muscle, not only in your skeletal muscle, but also in your heart. We know histidine is an antioxidant and an anti-inflammatory. So scavenges free radicals and binds toxic metals, helping reduce oxidative stress and inflammation. So a lot of key functions for this very important amino acid. Now, let's look at some of the research here. Let's dive a little bit deeper. So, on the biochemistry of histidine, I'll blow this up for you. Again, one of the 9 essential amino acids humans must obtain from the diet. So, key word there is you got to eat it. You know, you can supplement with it, but you should be looking for foods with it. And we'll talk about the foods that contain histidine shortly. Performs important anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and anti-secretory functions in the body. Deficiencies in histidine can pose problems across various body systems: skin, kidney, blood, neuropsychiatric, and immune system dysfunction are all potential possible side effects of histidine deficiency. Essential histidine metabolic byproducts are histamine. As I mentioned earlier, you can't make histamine without histidine. Something called urocanic acid, as well as muscle dipeptides. I mentioned carnosine a moment ago as one of those. It acts as a neurotransmitter. It modulates inflammation response. It helps with gastric acid regulation. The urocanic acid that it helps to produce helps to create the skin barrier. How does your skin protect you from UV light? In part by this chemical, precursored by histidine. So histidine also has links to UV light absorption and immunosuppression. Coming down here, histidine residues are also crucial to maintaining the myelin sheath. As I mentioned earlier, histamine is released by mast cells to bind histamine receptors, and there are several different types of histamine receptors, and so lots of different functions. We'll talk about those shortly. You can see the metabolic production of carnosine, which combats intramuscular acidosis, again, buffering. It maintains proper pH in the muscles, and there have been research studies showing the enhancements of exercise because of maintaining that proper pH. Okay, let's pull up some chemistry here for those of you who like to get nerdy. Here's histidine right in the center of this diagram, and what we've got here is the breakdown pathways, or the metabolic end pathways of histidine. So, you know, we get histidine through eating, so we get it through the diet, and then one of those pathways going in this direction here. There's an enzyme called histidase. We require zinc. It's a zinc is required for this thing to work, and that's how we produce this substance, urocanic acid. Now, as I just mentioned, this one's important for the skin. You can see here, since the skin lacks the enzyme to make this stuff, it's important that you have histidine. Histidine helps with the buildup of this substance in your skin, and that provides natural moisturizing factors for the skin, as well as UV absorbing compounds, ultraviolet. So it basically gives your skin natural sunscreen. And it's why it's so important to eat protein. So many people avoiding the protein and avoiding the sun. You know, the doctors are saying animal protein is bad and sunshine is bad, and here we are smathering ourselves in sunscreens that are full of carcinogens in order to protect ourselves. But the protection is built in with a great diet. We know that histidine can also form histamine. Now, this process to make histidine into histamine requires this B vitamin, vitamin B6, something called pyridoxine or pyridoxal 5-phosphates. It's very important that you have adequate B6 in your diet as well if you want to make histamine appropriately. Now, if we look at histamine, here's a table right here to the right. You see histamine receptors. There are 4 different major types of receptors for histamine, and they all have different functions. And as I was saying earlier, some of you maybe suffer from seasonal allergies, are thinking, I need to not eat histidine so that I don't make histamine, but it doesn't quite work that way. Some of the histamine receptors actually help protect you from allergens. So we've got different ones. We've got what are called H1 receptors. These are found in the brain, in the lungs. They're also found in the smooth muscle of your blood vessels and in your lymphatic or your lymphocytes, your white blood cells. And so you can see the main function is it causes bronchoconstriction as well as vasodilation. This is what, for many people, leads to the skin rash, that urticaria, and induces wakefulness in the brain. We also have H2 receptors. These ones are found in the stomach, the gastric parietal cells. They're also found in the smooth muscle, brain, and heart. But what do they mainly do? Stimulates these gastric parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. Now, how many of you suffer with low stomach acid. As a matter of fact, many people that get diagnosed with gastric reflux don't have too much acid. They actually have this problem right here. They have low acid in the stomach. When you don't have enough acid and then you try to eat your food, when you're trying to eat your protein, you don't break it down. That acid's a requirement to break protein down and to break it down into smaller substrates of amino acids, etc. So when your acid levels are low, your protein doesn't digest properly, and it can actually sit in your gut, weigh your gut down, create putrefaction byproducts, which isn't good, but it can cause for a lot of people that sense of bloating after a meal, or that sense of heaviness, and ultimately can lead to severity of constipation. So we want to make sure that we can produce stomach acid, right, an adequate quantity of stomach acid, so that we can digest our protein, so that we can have regular bowel movements and avoid constipation. So what happens when you take an antihistamine to block your allergies is you're also blocking your body's ability to produce stomach acid. And this is why so many people who are allergy sufferers also have gastrointestinal problems. So it's an important note to make. If you're on those kinds of medications, understand that consequence and side effect is going to be protein maldigestion, which can lead to a host of other types of problems. Now, we also have these H2 receptors in smooth muscle, brain, and heart tissue as well. So again, if you're taking those antihistamines, it's going to potentially affect all of those. And we now have research studies that show that taking antihistamines affects the brain and increases the risk of the development of cognitive decline and dementia. So, not saying don't take your medicine if you're being prescribed. What I'm saying is you should have that conversation with your doctor about the potential for these side effects, because nobody wants to trade allergies for cognitive decline and dementia. We also have H3 receptors, exclusively found in nerves. And their job is to inhibit the release of histamine. So this is where I was saying it's not quite as simple as don't take histidine so that you don't make histamine, because this type of receptor actually helps you with allergic responses, and so you want it. So you can see it inhibits the release of histamine from histaminergic neurons, promoting healthy sleep. We have H4 receptors that are important on immune cells, mast cells, and intestinal epithelial cells, sensory neurons, as well as cancer cells, which induces what's known as chemostasis, chemotaxis, and degranulation of mast cells. So why is that important? Why do we want degranulation of these mast cells? We don't want too much. If you've heard of mast cell activation syndrome, or MCAS, a lot of people who are in mold develop hyperallergenicity. And the reason why is some mold toxins, specifically one called Zea, causes your immune cells causes your immune system to produce more mast cells. And that leads to more histamine response. And so people oftentimes in mold will have tremendous food reactions. They'll have tremendous amount of food allergy problems. They'll start collecting food allergies, and they'll become hyperallergenic to most things. But we actually need these mast cells. They're very important, because when they do degranulate, that histamine that's released serves as a part of healthy inflammation. And we need that healthy inflammation as part of how we break down damaged tissue and clear and make room for the recovery and the rebuilding of new tissue. And I talked about this recently in our show on resolvins. If you haven't watched that show on SPMs, SPMs are substrates of omega-3 fat that help to resolve inflammation or help to lead to healthy inflammation. So many of you maybe that are struggling here with excessive histamine problems and chronic inflammation, you definitely, those of you who are having that problem, want to go back and watch my crash course on SPM, because that might be something that's extremely helpful for you. But coming back to this diagram, so histidine makes histamine. There's different receptor sites, or different types of receptors for histamine with multiple different types of functions. We know that also that a breakdown product of histidine, besides this urocanic acid in the skin, can actually contribute to the formation of L-glutamate, which in turn helps you make glutamine. Now, why is that important? So glutamine's not an essential amino acid, meaning you can take and you can make glutamine from histidine ultimately you can get to glutamine as well. What does glutamine do? Glutamine is the primary fuel for enterocytes. Those are your small intestine cells. And so glutamine deficiency can cause leaky gut. So now we're talking about histidine playing a role indirectly through glutamine in leaky gut. But we also know that glutamine is not just the primary fuel source for enterocytes, but it's also the primary fuel source for lymphocytes. And these are specialized white blood cells that help you produce antibodies and recognize good guys from bad guys and help your immune response work effectively. So glutamine is a very important amino acid that we can derive from histidine through this pathway of breakdown. This right here, this tetrahydrofolate, this is folate. This is vitamin B9. For those of you who, again, want to geek out on biochemistry. So histidine's fate leads to many beneficial chemicals that will help your body function properly. The other nutrients involved in helping histidine do this are zinc, vitamin B6, as well as vitamin B9 in the form of methylfolate. Keyword methylfolate. Don't take folic acid. For that, folic acid is synthetic folate, and not something I really recommend that you do. Okay, here is just kind of a larger diagram, more simple. You can see histidine through this enzyme, histidine decarboxylase requiring vitamin B6, creates histamine. Okay, one of the other breakdown paths is that histamine, when histamine is formed, it breaks down into something called N-methylhistamine, and that requires S-adenosylmethionine, which is a methyl donor. Basically, this molecule drops off a methyl group and methylates histamine to break it down. And that's an important part of histamine degradation so that we can recycle these amino acids. Okay, some other functions of histamine here. So these are some of the functions of the proteins that are produced as a result of histidine. And so you can see HIS, that's histidine, rich proteins or peptides. So in this case, this top box, you can see heme-containing proteins. These are your hemoglobin and your myoglobin. Myoglobin is the equivalent of hemoglobin, but it's in your muscle. And it's important for oxygen in your muscle, for that oxygen carriage in your muscle. So again, these two proteins, hemoglobin and myoglobin, responsible for carrying oxygen. And oxygen's a rate limiter for how your body is able to produce energy. We also know nitric oxide synthase. That's the chemical that helps to produce nitric oxide. Now, if you watch my crash course on arginine, we talk about how nitric oxide is made. You need histidine to convert arginine into nitric oxide because it helps to drive that enzyme. And what does arginine do? As it makes nitric oxide, this helps with blood vessel dilation. So otherwise you get stiff blood vessels that won't dilate. You can develop high blood pressure and other problems. So histidine playing a role in that. We also know there are enzymes called catalases, which are beneficial enzymes that help the body function properly. Also chemicals called cytochromes. These are very common. Cytochromes are in the liver and help with detoxification. So pretty important, histidine, in that regard. Now there's also something called a histidine-rich glycoprotein. And these are very important in regulating several processes, biologically speaking, such as coagulation, which is blood clotting, but also immunity. We know that histatins are compounds where, especially in the saliva, where histidine will bind to copper and zinc, and these different proteins have antibacterial, antifungal, and wound healing properties, and have been investigated for treatment of different oral inflammatory diseases. So these three types of proteins all require histidine. Then we get down to the histidine-rich calcium-binding proteins, which play a role in storage and release of calcium. Remember, calcium is an electrolyte, and it allows your nerves and your muscles to work properly. Histidine playing the role here. So you can see cardiac sarcoplasmic reticulum. There's a specialized type of organelle inside your heart cells. These help regulate calcium flow and regulate the rhythm of how your heart beats. So very important in that regard. And then there's a protein called filaggrin, which is in your skin barrier. And so this is what we were talking about earlier, where the formation of the natural moisturizing factor in the skin. this is a protein that helps aid in that. So histidine, lots of different functions, lots of very important functions